Why did Adolf Hitler choose Berlin, even when he knew the war was already lost? In the final months of World War II, he had one chance to escape, a chance to move south, a chance to disappear, a chance to survive, but he refused. Instead, he stayed in a city that was collapsing above him, a city being crushed by Soviet artillery, a city where every street was turning into ruins, a city that was no longer a capital, but a death zone. So the question becomes unavoidable: was Berlin a choice, or was it something far more psychological? Because what happened inside Hitler's mind during those final weeks changed everything we thought we knew about him, and the truth is far darker than simple strategy. Title: Expansion. Berlin was not just a city. To understand why Hitler stayed in Berlin, you cannot look at maps, you have to look at belief. To Hitler, Berlin was not just Germany's capital, it was the symbol of everything he had built. A city he wanted to transform into Germania. A futuristic imperial capital that would represent his 1,000-year vision. Massive stone structures, gigantic boulevards, monuments that would outlast history itself. But by 1945, none of that existed. Instead of empire, there was ruin. Instead of triumph, there was collapse. And yet Hitler still refused to leave, because in his mind, leaving Berlin meant accepting defeat. And Hitler never accepted defeat, not even when the war was already over in reality. But what kept him tied to this city so deeply was not only ideology, it was something personal. Background: the falling empire. By early 1945, Nazi Germany was collapsing from every direction. From the east, the Soviet Red Army was advancing rapidly. From the west, Allied forces had already crossed the Rhine. The cities were falling one after another. Supply lines were destroyed. Communication systems were breaking. And Berlin was next. Inside the Führer bunker, Hitler received reports that painted a clear picture. Germany could not win, but he refused to move. Why? Because Berlin was not just the center of the war effort, it was the center of his identity. Every major decision, every military command, every ideological vision had passed through Berlin. Leaving it would mean something psychologically unbearable for him: loss of control. But as the Soviet army came closer, control was already gone, and Hitler knew it. Yet he stayed. This contradiction is where the real story begins. Core story. Why Berlin became his fixed point inside Hitler's bunker, time stopped feeling real. There were no windows, no sunlight, no outside world, only reports, maps, and the distant sound of artillery shaking the ground. But Hitler still behaved as if Berlin could be saved. He gave orders to non-existent armies. He demanded counterattacks that could never happen. He moved divisions on paper that no longer existed in reality. And Berlin remained the center of every command. But why? Because Berlin represented three things to Hitler: power, identity, and psychological survival. If Berlin fell, it was not just Germany that would collapse, it was his entire life's narrative. So instead of leaving, he did something more dangerous. He stayed inside the collapse, surrounded by loyalists who no longer believed in victory, but still obeyed him. And that obedience kept the illusion alive a little longer. But outside the bunker, reality was closing in fast. Escalation, a city under fire. By April 1945, Berlin was being torn apart, street by street, building by building, block by block. Soviet forces had entered the city. Tank battles erupted in residential areas. Civilian shelters were overcrowded and collapsing, and still, Hitler refused evacuation plans. He rejected proposals to move south to Bavaria. He rejected escape routes that could have saved his life. Even his closest advisors were shocked. Because logically, leaving made sense. But Hitler was no longer thinking logically, he was thinking symbolically. Berlin was no longer a capital, it was a stage, and he had already decided how the final act would end. But what pushed him into this mental state? Was it loyalty to Germany? Or something far more psychological, something like identity collapse? Because for Hitler, escaping Berlin meant becoming ordinary again, and that was something he could not accept. Inside the Führer bunker, the world had shrunk to a few rooms. The walls were shaking from bomb impacts. Electricity flickered. Air was heavy and suffocating, and Hitler's condition was deteriorating rapidly. He trembled, he shouted, then suddenly became silent for hours. One moment he believed Berlin would be saved. The next moment he admitted everything was lost, but even in collapse, he stayed in Berlin. Why? Because the bunker had become a psychological anchor. Outside the bunker was humiliation, capture, trial, defeat. Inside the bunker was control, even if it was an illusion. And Hitler chose illusion over reality, every time. As Soviet troops moved closer, the bunker became less of a command center and more of a waiting room for the end. But Hitler still refused to leave the city, because leaving would mean facing a truth he had avoided his entire life. That Berlin was not his destiny. It was his downfall. Final events. The city falls by late April. Berlin was completely surrounded. The Red Army had encircled the city. No escape routes remained. Families hid in basements. Soldiers fought street battles with no reinforcements. Smoke covered the sky. Inside the bunker, Hitler received the final confirmation. No relief forces were coming. This was the end. Still, he did not leave Berlin. Instead, he prepared for death. Because in his mind, death inside Berlin was not defeat. It was control over the narrative. He would not be captured. He would not be displayed. He would not be judged in a courtroom. Berlin would be his final location. Not because it was safe, but because it was symbolic. And that symbolism mattered more to him than survival. But what made him think like this? That is where psychology becomes unavoidable. Reflection: why Berlin meant everything. Hitler's decision to stay in Berlin was not military logic. It was psychological dependency. Berlin represented his rise, his power, his identity as Führer. Leaving it would mean breaking the story he built about himself. And that was something he could not emotionally survive. So instead of escaping, he stayed inside the collapse, watching everything he built disappear around him. But here is the deeper truth. Berlin did not trap him physically. It trapped him mentally, because by the end he no longer saw Berlin as a city. He saw it as himself. And when Berlin fell, he fell with it. Outro, the question that remains. So why did Hitler really choose Berlin? Not because it was safe, not because it was strategic, not because it was practical, but because Berlin was the last place where his illusion of control still existed. And when that illusion broke, there was nowhere left to go. Because sometimes a city is not just a location in history. Sometimes it becomes the final mirror of a collapsing mind.